Hey everybody, thanks for joining us here on 9 News Watch. I'm joined by our 9 News reporter, director of reporting, Chris Vanderveen, for another look here at the Omicron variant in particular. Also going to take a look here at how COVID continues to develop here in the state of Colorado. Probably got a little bit of good news on the second part of things about how the virus is developing here in the state of Colorado, or perhaps easing a little bit. But I want to start things off with the big news of the day with the first case of the variant, something that you said back on Monday that you knew was coming, that we all knew was coming, that we were going to have this variant be discovered here in Colorado, or in the U.S.
It's one of those things that's news. It's important to cover. The variant is here in the United States. It's also important to provide, this is one of those moments where it's really critically important to provide context to all of this, and the context is we knew this was coming. We knew that this was going to happen. It's in California, so there's things that we already know about the person that has the variant in California. They travel from South Africa, and there's been no indication of sort of localized, what they call community spread. And that's really sort of the next level. We knew this was going to happen, and I think the chances of seeing community spread, meaning it's caught by a person who hasn't traveled overseas, that's very high as well. We're going to see that happen as well. The first step was what we saw today. I'm not panicking. I don't think anybody who works in the public health sector is panicking by this because we knew it was going to happen.
And you explicitly said so. You tweeted back on Monday. You said it here, right here on this very, right in front of this very camera back here on Monday as well. That said, are there any indications from what we've learned from the person who contracted? Is there anything more that we know at this point?
Mild symptoms, which is a good sign. And that's where we're at. I mean, there's lots of questions. What's interesting to me is that all of this sort of seems somewhat familiar because this is sort of what we went through at the beginning of this. Is so we wait to see that first person, and when COVID was seen here, SARS-CoV-2 was found in the United States, it was a person that had traveled, and then you start to wait for the more important question is there community spread? We now know it's really difficult to sort of, like, this is such a contagious disease that it's really difficult to sort of limit community spread. We're going to see community spread, meaning one person who's traveled then infects a person who hasn't traveled, and then people who haven't traveled overseas, they start spreading it amongst themselves. That's community spread. We know we're going to see that as well. But again, this is all entirely predictable. The questions that we had back on Monday still pertain to today. What's the level of sickness? Are we seeing higher acuity patients? Are we seeing more hospitalizations? We can't answer that question right now, but so far, the preliminary data is not bad. Does that mean it's not going to turn? No, but it needs, everything that we're seeing right now is what you would want to see when you see a new variant, except for the fact that we know it's highly transmissible. We know that, and we're used to that with Delta. Delta is very transmissible. Everything is pointing to Omicron being very transmissible as well.
Is there anything more, again, back on Monday, and now you're still preaching the patience part of things, that we're going to have to wait, just like you were saying back in March 2020, we had to wait to see things develop. Is there anything we've learned between Monday and now about this variant?
I think the transmissibility thing is what we're learning a lot about that it's very transmissible. I don't think that comes as a big shock to people that investigate the virus. I think we're still a week or so out from sort of learning, are we seeing higher acuity patients? Are we seeing more hospitalizations? Keep in mind that everything, we've talked about this a lot, but it's a good time to review it, is that everything sort of lags. A case today doesn't result in a hospitalization case tomorrow. So it takes a person who gets sick anywhere from sort of 6 to 14 days to end up in the hospital. So the people who are getting sick now, they don't instantly go to the hospital. It takes some time for the virus to sort of get going and infect the lungs, and that's really the primary driver why people end up in the hospital to begin with. So you have to wait a little bit longer to see because right now you have a small patient population. It's still growing. We're seeing it more, and in areas where you don't see a lot of the Omicron variant, it's going to take some time for it to sort of gain a foothold. And the question that I want to know is, once it gains a foothold in the community, can it overtake Delta? That's still a huge question. And one thing that you're not going to know when it's still spreading in its preliminary stage is it leading to more hospitalizations. There will be some data, and some data right now is not bad news. But I think we need to learn more about, are we going to see increased hospitalizations?
So that'll be the next thing to watch for. One thing we do know, and more pertinent to us here in Colorado, is that cases hospitalizations are going down, and there may be perhaps some good news here
Yeah,
locally.
I think there definitely is some good news, and I sort of put that with a word of caution. We all know from experience that holiday weeks, holiday weekends are tough to gauge because cases inevitably go down because testing goes down. There's been a huge drop off in cases, but I'm not so as much interested in that as I am in two things right now, which I'm watching closely: positivity and hospitalizations. Positivity is still very high; it's still close to 10%, although it's been dropping recently. But 10% is an area where you don't want to be. That's a lot of cases. But more importantly, to our system, which I think is the most important thing about why there are restrictions that come in the first place, is hospitalizations. Hospitalizations matter the most. We don't want to overwhelm the system. And what you've seen over the last week is the bending of the curve, that the curve is starting to go down. Now, I'm cautious about that because we saw that bending of the curve downward in September, and then it went back up again. So it doesn't mean that this is a permanent going down, and I'm probably more cautious than a lot of people on Twitter are, but I think it's important because we've seen this before. The question is, can the downward trend sustain itself? We were over 1,600 patients. We're now in the lower 1,500 to 1,400. So we've dropped off 100, 150 net patients in the last week. That's good news because 3 weeks ago we were adding 150 to 200 patients per week. Now we're decreasing in net. And that's a sign that things are changing. And things have definitely changed because it doesn't matter if fewer people get tested or fewer cases. If you're sick, you're sick. And if you're sick enough to end up in the hospital, it doesn't matter how many tests you're doing. It just means you're going to end up in the hospital. That's one of those things that doesn't sort of subscribe itself to what happens in holidays. And so that's why I look at hospitalizations. And that's telling us something relatively good here in the state of Colorado, that maybe things are starting to turn.
Is there a known reason as to why things might be starting to turn?
There's all sorts of theories as to why that's out there. I think there is one of those things is that the virus tends to burn itself out. I've likened an analogy that I use a lot is like getting a campfire going. And you try to get it going, and it burns a little bit, and sometimes it burns itself out. But once it gets going, and it can burn really hot, and if you don't supply any more fuel to it, it goes back down again. And the same type of thing, I think what's happening, especially, this is one of the explanations why Florida, remember a few months ago, Florida was burning mad, like crazy, and it was really high activity, and now it's way down. And I think that's why this sort of campfire analogy is apropos, because you sort of see, like, if it burns really hot for a short period of time, it can also burn down pretty quickly too. I think that's one explanation. I also think there's a seasonal aspect to it. I think there's people start to realize when it's starting to get more active because they have friends. Think about one of the big drivers to you changing your behavior is if you know somebody who gets sick. And I know myself. I've known more people in the last month that have gotten sick than I had for the previous few months. I've known people who have gotten sick. People in the circle that I go around with, I've known people who have gotten sick. So that changes your behavior well. So the combination of all of those, I think, is what's leading to this.
Okay, so that, at the very least, though, there seems to be some indications that things are starting to bend back down. But you said you were cautious about things because we saw this similar bending back in September. When do you think we'll have a better idea that this may be a bit more of a sustain?
I give it a couple of weeks. Okay. I give it, and I think we also, we have the variables of, like, we know people were together for Thanksgiving. I don't think it's inevitable that that's going to lead to another surge. I know lots of people think that that's the case. It didn't happen last year. We were in the decline last year after Thanksgiving. I think that's still possible now. But give it a couple weeks and take a look at it. I think what we've also, the most important lesson, one of the more important lessons that we've learned over the last year and a half, is that just when you think you're good, things can change. And sometimes when you think things are terrible, things can change too. I think we're still learning a lot about this, and I think there's some variables, but give it a couple of weeks and see where we're at and see if we're still in that decline.
All right, so hopefully some good news there. With the variant, it's basically what we expected.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you would expect it to come here to Colorado.
It'll pop up in Colorado. It's like we're going to find a case here in Colorado. It's inevitable. It doesn't mean this newsroom's going to freak out. It doesn't mean you or I have to freak out. These are things that are just going to happen with time. Again, it showing up is not the big deal. It gaining a foothold, like Delta did. Almost all the cases in Colorado right now are still Delta. Delta gained a foothold in the community. If a new variant gains a foothold in a community like Delta did, then that changes the game, and that will be a game changer. We're not there yet. We don't see that happening, but if it does happen, that's another thing to look at because it's a new variable in the process. It's a new variant, and it means that new variants tend to do things that sometimes are unexpected, and that's what happens.
So what's I guess the big question we all have is, when does this cycle stop? How does this end?
I mean, for some people, it's the unpopular opinion. I subscribe to the idea of vaccinations are the key to get out of this. I think boosters are necessary for lots of people, particularly people who are in that vulnerable age range. The reality is COVID's always going to be around. I mean, we're going to be like, don't expect to get into the summer of next year and think, oh, we're done with COVID. COVID cases are going to pop up, but the question is, can you have a situation where COVID doesn't lead to a spike in hospitalizations? Once you get to an era where you may have case increases, but people aren't getting as sick because they're vaccinated and that type of thing. Once you're in that situation, I think we can say it's as over as it's going to get. It's still going to be around, like the flu and the cold and all sorts of other things, and we're going to sort of be somewhat vulnerable to it, but we're going to learn to live with it. I think that's probably the best explanation, and the key is don't have an overwhelming of this. That's been the key from day one. Don't have an overwhelming of your hospital system, because as we've shown, when a hospital system is overwhelmed, you get suboptimal care. When you have suboptimal care, people are going to die as a result of that.
All right, so there you have it. Well, Chris, we appreciate a few minutes of your time breaking down the current situation in Colorado, along with what we know now about the variant, now that it has been detected in the state of California. But again, calm, no reason.
Newsworthy, absolutely newsworthy, but newsworthy within context. That's the key.
All right, so and the context being, we knew it was going to happen, and hopefully it doesn't gain a foothold in the community.
Yeah, totally.
So there you have it. 9 News reporter, director of reporting, 9 News director of reporting.
I have a very long, ridiculous title.
Director of reporting, Chris Vanderveen. I'm just Chris Bianchi. Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Watch.